Hello, this is a pre-recorded presentation. My name is Andrew Ream. I work with Raftellus, and I'm here to talk a bit about the preliminary findings that came out of or have come out of the water and wastewater rate and TAP or capacity fee study that we've been completing over the approximately a little less than a year. The town awarded the proposal through a competitive bid process about a year ago. And so we're going to be bringing forward ordinances, but before we do that, and that'll be a future meeting, but before we do that, I want to walk you through and get your input around preliminary findings. So I'll be presenting this ahead of time and then attending the meeting on the 19th to present a few more areas on comparison surveys to other resort communities as well as other communities within Wyoming, and to receive input, just answer questions, discussions, and whatnot. So look forward to seeing you all on the 19th virtually. So in terms of this pre-recorded presentation, this agenda slide documents, we're going to do a little bit of a review, just high-level background, sort of how we got here and why was the study initiated, some of the big picture drivers, and then we'll dial in and drill down to one of the major outputs, which is capacity fee recommendations, and some alternatives we established, as well as some impacts to residential and commercial customers from those alternatives, and then talk a little bit about the financial plan and the multi-year evaluation, and from which we developed and completed a cost of service analysis and developed rate alternatives for both water and wastewater. So at the end, that's where we're close, is around those alternatives and some customer bill impacts. And as I mentioned, I'll share the survey slides when I'm there virtually on the 19th. So just big picture, some overall constraints, as well as some future challenges that go around the entire study. So first and foremost, it's been about 20 years since the last comprehensive study was completed by the town of Jackson. There were, as you saw in your packet, historical rate adjustments. The town staff completed an update in 2011, and there are 3 years of rate adjustments around that. And then they've been updated for certain contract customers outside of the town per that contract. Overall, since this time, the utilities invested in water and wastewater facilities and assets, and has identified the need to increase that investment. We're hitting a reinvestment cycle primarily around pipes and buried infrastructure, as these have been identified by Nelson Engineering working closely with town staff, and resulted in a prioritized multi-year capital plan that we integrated within the rate study. Capital requirements often drive the need to adjust or increase rates and rate revenue and other revenues, and in this case capacity fee revenues as well. But that's one of the big drivers, and that's one of the big reasons why we're recommending not just for inflation but also for this capital reinvestment increases over the next several years. We start with current rates and bills in Jackson among some of the lowest in the state and among peer communities. So I'll show this and demonstrate this in some survey slides that'll be presented on the 19th. But in general, water is one of the things that is pretty affordable as we compare it to other communities. What part of that? Well, rates haven't been adjusted in 7 years. So to some degree, bill increases will be necessary, and it's unavoidable. And that's just for inflation, let alone the additional capital reinvestment. So that kind of sets the stage for what followed within our study and what I'm going to be talking about with you in this pre-recorded version. So as part of our study, we asked the community what the pricing objectives were. And while this was primarily around rates, there's aspects that influenced capacity fee setting as well. For capacity fees, the objective was that growth should pay its own way. And there were some current concerns around how redevelopment was participating in those costs with a meter size based schedule. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But in terms of these objectives, these 6 things for rate setting through interactions with the CRC, who council tasked with working with us and town staff and more deeply evaluating the issues and looking at rates and rate structures and customer bill impacts. And from your packet, we completed 7 meetings, and we did just that. So part of it was working with them to select and prioritize pricing objectives. We also heard from you all through a presentation in April and discussion there, as well as additional feedback provided through town staff and throughout the process. Lastly, we completed a survey, an online survey, where we asked citizens to also provide what was important and the objectives they were looking for with this evaluation. And what we see are the top 6 pricing objectives that came through those multi-channels, and were integrated within our evaluation and ultimately the rates I'm going to be talking about with you today. So first, minimizing customer bill impacts. This influenced the rate design and the extent and pace that we were seeking to eliminate any sort of cost of service inequities identified within the study. Rate stability, second objective, resulted in us looking at multi-year rate revenue adjustments rather than spending cash down to our reserve minimums and then having a cliff and a big spike that we would have to then implement to kind of pull out of the deep dive. So doing a little more even plan along the way helps us avoid those cliffs and those spikes. In terms of revenue stability, we achieved that through higher base rates and more revenue through the base rate. And then for 2 alternatives in water and 1 in sewer, we also are proposing including a minimum volume allowance and a minimum charge under these preferred alternatives, preferred by the CRC in the town. In terms of affordability, that also influenced affordability of essential water services. Influenced our rate setting through the amount we were looking to get through that base rate, as well as in the case of alternatives 2 and alternative 3 on the water side, tiered volume rates that provide higher rates for outdoor discretionary water and lower rates for essential water used primarily inside. In terms of cost of service equity, this was improved through the new rate structure, as we identified some inequities, and we have recommendations that start filling that gap and closing that gap. But we determined that we didn't want to try and close the gap all in 1 year. It built up over the last 20 years, and it also reflects the system-wide rate structure in place today. So a little more gradual elimination, and future studies and adjustments may seek to further close that gap. Lastly, conservation and demand management. We clearly heard that from both citizens and council. It was the number 6 objective for the CRC, and that led us to looking at a couple different ways to send a stronger pricing signal, conservation pricing signal, through tiered rates or seasonal rates under alternatives 2 and 3 that we'll be talking about. We also, for all alternatives, recommend establish an irrigation-only customer class, and that'll enable the town in the future to kind of target those set of users more individually than as grouped as part of schools or government or commercial or residences, kind of have the setup in place today. And we also have some recommendations for irrigation only, sending pricing signals to the developer builder through the capacity fee, where assessing that based on landscaped area in one alternative, the other maintaining a meter size based approach, but sending a little bit more clear pricing signal up front to the developer, to the builder, making those choices on landscaping, and hopefully a better kind of long-term signal. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So before we get into the capacity fees, I just want to talk about some sort of important kind of more higher level drivers when it comes to the value of end use of water. The reality is sanitary and health and safety uses of water, primarily indoor uses, toilet flushing, cooking, cleaning, running water for those purposes. The most necessary is generally the least amount of water. Then we move on to economic, and this in the front and center for many Jackson commercial customers is that it's tied into delivery of a service or good. And that good may be seasonal residents or year-round residents, but it's essential for those purposes. And it's less discretionary than we get into recreational, and again, this is big in Jackson, that we've got inflow streams and we've got businesses and activities and just enjoyment of life tied to natural spaces and preserving clean water in those spaces. And some of the reasons why we have water and sewer utilities to begin with is to ensure that and ensure that water we capture from that is safe for people to use and consume and interact with. But it's also an important end use. And we start getting into the last one, the outdoor aesthetic. And this is where we use the most water. It tends to be the most discretionary. And this may be landscaped areas or grass, but this is really the focus of when we're looking to send a efficiency signal. This is where we want to send it around this most discretionary use of water. And then along the way, we want to disincentivize people from wasting water. And so that can come through in the signals as well. In terms of dynamic that balances efficiency versus conservation, conservation is achieved through the rate alternatives and particularly the seasonal and tiered alternatives we'll be talking about. But it's recommended that the town moving forward invests additional in GIS data so that we get tied to the utility individual meter, whether it's landscaped area or building spaces for that individual customer. And while we have that for many customers, we don't have it for everybody. So if we gather that for everybody, existing customers, that'll enable the town to take even further steps that enhance more of this efficiency and maximize the conservation signal by marrying these two. So it's a little less about a typical customer, and that's the way these alternatives have been designed, or at least alternative 3, but then it gets into more variable and scalable so that it's an efficiency signal, and we're dialing in that conservation pricing signal even further than what is being proposed in the 2 alternatives we're going to be talking about in a minute. So I'm going to switch gears to the capacity fee. I've talked about it a little bit, but the next several slides are going to focus solely around the capacity fee. And this is just as a reminder, this is a one-time fee, payment, if you will, that seeks to recover the unit cost and the impact of that new or increased development on, in this case, water and wastewater facilities. It's typically collected at the time the building permits are issued, and it's a one-time fee just for new or increased development. There are some restrictions. We cannot use this for operation and maintenance expenses. It's reserved only for capital and debt service and really intended to defray that expansionary growth-related element. And keep in mind that it's a contractual fee for a service. It gives the connector essentially a perpetual right of service that is guaranteed through the payment of the fee, and also paying rates and being current and all that. But it isn't a tax, and while some may characterize it as such, it's been heavily litigated over the last 50 years, and as long as we meet some certain tests and it's prepared following some best practices, and there's some elements we go through, but that's how we ensure that it's not a tax. So what we've developed are the maximum supportable fees, and we've calculated through 2 different assessment mechanisms or 2 different structures. The first alternative maintains meter size based fees and simply updates or increases for that value. Keep in mind these have not adjusted on the water side except for maybe a year or 2 of inflationary adjustments for almost 20 years. And so there's taking that in one increase to the maximum supportable amount is a big step. And over that same 20 years, the town has continued to reinvest in the water system, increasing that value as well. Under alternative 2, we treat things a little differently, and primarily residential assessment for both multifamily and single family. We break this into 2 elements, an indoor element and an outdoor element. The indoor element is around bedrooms, and the outdoor element is around the landscaped area, and really the amount of water for that landscaped area and recovering that in a more scalable fashion, factoring in that individualized or individual landscaped area for each of these new developments or increased development. A second component of this is we add an irrigation-only assessment for new irrigation-only customers that, again, is centered around landscaped area and is a way to get beyond meter size and really more proportionally affect bigger landscaped area is going to need more water, and so we're going to recover more of that within the capacity fee rather than relying simply on meter size to recover those increased amounts and sort of blocks, if you will. So the fee structure, and this is alternative 1 and it's as well as alternative 2 for commercial or non-residential customers. So we've got proposed an increase to that maximum supportable level for a 3/4 inch or the majority of the customers on the system of approximately $2,100. And again, this fee hasn't been updated substantially in 20 years. And over this time, the town has continued to invest in facilities, and things are more expensive than they were 20 years ago. We're also proposing adjusting the ratio of 1 inch and larger meter sizes to that 3/4 inch amount, reflecting more of a best practice with the flow ratios being restricted more on the meter size and less based on just sort of the size of the pipe and some of the math in terms of the area of that pipe that the current ratios reflect. So a little bit different and not quite as large for your case of, say, a 6-inch meter that we don't get very many of these. I'm not sure the last time we've added a 6-inch meter, but there aren't many of them on the system, if any. The second alternative is, as I mentioned earlier, is focused and it's different for single family and multifamily residential. Here, we look at bedroom size, and in one case with and without laundry, and then we assume laundry is attached to 2-bedroom and larger, and the amount of water, roughly 70 gallons per day in the peak season, based on Nelson Engineering's evaluation, and the unit cost of the overall water system or facility. So if you're a 2-bedroom, we're proposing for the indoor element, you'd be charged $949 and then pay $365 per 1,000 square feet of landscaped areas. And as we can see, this increases for 3-bedroom, and then 4-bedroom and larger for the indoor portion would be assessed $316 for each additional bedroom. On the wastewater side, we've also maintained under alternative 1 the existing assessment schedules and worked with Nelson Engineering and town staff to identify the underlying assumed water use. So there's some changes there, and then there's some additional categories for things that Public Works, different land uses, different end users that we get in Jackson. And rather than some guesswork about which of the existing categories to apply, we've called them out and we've got some new categories. And here we're simply updating again for that maximum supportable amount while we modify some of the parameters of the assessment schedules that have been in place for roughly 30 years. Under alternative 2, again, we focus on residential, and we've got some differences, again, based on bedrooms. So similar to what we're doing on the water side, bedrooms generate water and, indoor goes down the drain and must be treated by the wastewater system after it's collected and conveyed to the treatment plant. For non-residential, it maintains the same recommendations and changes that we've got on alternative 1 around the existing schedule with some new categories being added. So in terms of what these look like for the wastewater side, this is the layout here, and this gives us the existing fees for 2-bedroom and larger is $21.72. It's a flat fee. If you're larger than 2-bedroom, you pay the same fee as a 2-bedroom fee. Under alternative 1, we've increased that, and we're proposing for that to go up. Under alternative 2, we've got more of the scalable tied to the 200 gallons per day, and we've got that being applied, generating a varying amount depending on the number of bedrooms. Each additional bedroom would incur $1,137, and then as the existing schedule calls out apartment and 1 bedroom with and without laundry, we're maintaining that in alternative 1, and again tying back to the amount of water. And then under alternative 2, these are the same because it's the same assumptions and applied in a similar manner. Lastly, if it's sort of habitable space, there's a call out here in terms of not necessarily a bedroom, but the per 400 square feet. As we continue through, we've identified non-residential categories that I mentioned. We've updated the gallons per day. The assessment categories in a few instances have been modified, but ultimately it's more about updating the maximum supportable and the impacts that these users have on the system in these assessment categories. It's the same for alternatives 1 and 2 as I mentioned before. And so there's really no difference. And the schedule continues all the way through some of these additional uses and updates to ones on the schedule that have been in place. So now I'm going to move on to some example impacts that, again, this is new or increased development, so existing customers wouldn't be impacted at all. So to do so, we look at a few different profiles. I want to start with single family residential, and we've identified 4 different potential new customers. And each of these vary based on the lot size and the resulting landscaped area, as well as the number of bedrooms. The larger homes, B and C, require a larger meter size, and then homes A and D are served by a 3/4 inch or the base meter size we've got on the system. So what's shown here is the current capacity fee, and this is just for water, that would be assessed today. And then we're also showing maintaining this meter size based approach under alternative 1, what those increased amounts are. And under alternative 2, as I've talked about briefly, we've broken out the indoor and the outdoor calculations. So indoor is based on the number of bedrooms, and we see this difference. And then outdoor is also based on a scalable value, and in this case, the landscaped areas, because we've got different lot sizes. The LDRs require the percent of landscaping, and so this is a bit of a variable. And basically, the larger or smaller the lot, the larger or smaller the fee will be. And we see that in the combined indoor and outdoor fee. So under alternative 2, we're kind of, what in the industry we characterize this a bit like we're getting beyond meter size and into some of these additional measures. In terms of the wastewater side, for 2 bedrooms and larger, today they all pay for this $2,172. Under alternative 1, it would be increased to $4,547. And hopefully my video, I'm going to turn that off for a second so we can see the variance under alternative 2 that picks up the different number of bedrooms. So again, we're seeing this more scalable. If you've got fewer bedrooms, fewer people, and less of an impact on the system, and alternatively, the larger you go, the bigger the impact, and we see that coming through with how we're recovering this cost. So I'm going to move on to multifamily, and again, hide this so you can see it. In this case, we're looking at different numbers of 1-bedroom units, and the resulting meter size varies a bit to provide service to those differing demands or impacts on the system. The current fees would be increased under alternative 1, maintaining meter size based approaches, and then on alternative 2, we would bifurcate indoor and outdoor as we've talked about, and that would result in varying fees. And it's important to keep in mind that, say, a 1-inch or 1.5-inch meter could serve a varying number of these dwelling units. So it kind of goes up in chunks under the current approach or alternative 1, whereas under alternative 2, we'd see some more nuances depending on the number of units and again, their potential demand or anticipated demand on the water system facilities. For wastewater, alternatives 1 and 2 are the same for this user, and we see the increase to get to that maximum supportable amount. As I keep going, irrigation only, as you may recall under alternative 2, this is $365 per 1,000 square feet of irrigable area, or in this example, that would generate $7,300. Under alternative 1, it's just caught in this 1.5-inch meter that could serve a larger landscaped area, and so again, this is more of that scalable aspect. It's less about getting a guaranteed amount of revenue. We'd have some differences depending on the lot sizes, and again, this is part of giving that incentive to the developer, to the builder, making these choices on the landscaped areas so that we don't then have to incentivize someone to pull them out or charge them water based on the higher requirements of something that the developer or builder could have chosen something that's more in line with the Jackson environment or needs less water, and kind of a better choice for the arid west and the mountain west. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I want to get into the financial plan just as a high-level overview, some reminders, and then we'll talk through water results, cost of service, and rates and rate alternatives, and then repeat and do the same for wastewater, and that following that, that'll conclude the pre-recorded session. So this is just a little bit of a reminder, and going back to the presentation I gave in April, that we're looking at a 10-year financial planning period, and we worked with Nelson Engineering and town staff to prioritize capital improvements during that period. But we've got some drivers, and inflation happens, and certainly inflation on operating costs is one of the cost drivers, and to be expected. The town has issued debt in the past, and the water systems have, at least the water system's got debt service that remains. And then, as we've talked about, the capital, and that's one of the bigger drivers to generate some additional revenue, particularly on the water side, to fund increased capital needs. And so as we evaluate this, we look at revenues from user charges, and this is the enterprise fund, as I mentioned earlier, no taxes, so just capacity fees, ancillary charges, and our user fees that fund all of the system. And so we adjust that for anticipated growth, and really answering the question, are our revenues adjusted for growth sufficient to meet the needs of funding our system and maintaining some minimum financial criteria thresholds. And as part of that evaluation, the end result was that revenues aren't today sufficient, and we need to adjust those through rate revenue increases and rate revenue adjustments that we're proposing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of those big drivers, and again, what those rate revenue adjustments are, and then get into cost of service results and ultimately rate alternatives around how we recover those costs from different customers to be adopted through ordinances that will be brought to council at a later date. So the capital plan, and that one of those big elements that's driving the need to increase our water rate revenues. This depicts and summarizes the 10-year capital plan that overall would result in $22.4 million. And this is a prioritized multi-year capital improvement. So it's roughly $2 million, a little more than $2 million a year on average from our water system. Based on individual projects that have been identified, it's not just $2 million each year. We've got quite a bit of variance and some big improvements around Zone 3 storage tanks and water production and related facilities. We're proposing to issue debt to minimize the amount in cash funded and rate revenue we need to accrue ahead of those improvements so it's available in our reserves to fund them. We're going to issue some debt, and that helps us do a more level plan and a smaller amount. That's a big driver behind the recommendation to have 8% adjustments in fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23, the first of which could be effective July 1, 21. And those would be followed by 9% of adjustments in fiscal year 24 and 25. The ordinances, at least initially, and the rate alternatives we're talking about today are really focused around those that would be effective in that first year. And we'll get some direction today about multi-year rate schedules, rather if you want to see multi-year and 2 or 3 or 4 years, or if we want to contain ourselves just to those initial impacts, and that'll be part of the dialogue on the 19th and ultimately reflected in ordinances that'll be brought forward to council at a future date. So one of the other elements of the study is the cost of service evaluation. And for this, we've got 8% overall increase in fiscal year 22, as I mentioned. And so what this shows us, and we look at customer classes, we've broken out irrigation only as a standalone class, and we look at some of the other major groupings. And any class that's above 8% indicates there's a subsidy. And so what that means is multifamily and commercial have been subsidizing primarily single family residential, but schools, irrigation only, and to some degree, Three Creek. So part of, we could rectify this all in 1 year, or as determined part of the study is that we close the gap, but there'll be future adjustments that would be needed to kind of close this gap. So we've developed rates and 3 rate alternatives that would go into effect July 1, 2021. I'm going to talk about these, then we'll look at the nominal values, different rates, and some customer impacts around that. So under this, alternative 1 is most similar to the existing rate system, where we've got a base rate or base charge that increases by meter size. There's no minimum amount of volume or volume included, And then all metered volume is assessed a system-wide volume rate. That it doesn't matter if you're commercial, if you're putting it on your lawn, if it's going on a park, or whatnot. There's a separate sort of volume rates that may apply in Three Creek and some different policies there, but the vast majority of the customers, everybody's paying the system-wide rate. Under Alternative 2, we have changes initially around the base rate, and we're including and recommending 2,000 gallons be included regardless of meter size, and we're adding some amount to the base rate to recover that additional cost. Then we've got proposed what we characterize a uniform seasonal volume rate. So there are two different volume rates that could apply to different types of water. The indoor or initial or lower amount applies year-round to that indoor water, similar to how residential customers are billed for their average winter consumption. And then that increment during the summer months incurs a higher volume charge under this uniform seasonal approach. And that would apply to residential, commercial, all customers throughout the system using a system-wide rate, with the exception that Three Creek would continue to have their rate be calculated to recover their cost of service, but it would be through this similar structure. Under Alternative 3, we've got the same base rate difference as Alternative 2, but we've modified and we're looking at more of a fixed block rate structure designed for residential customers around typical or average lot size, where we've come up with fixed blocks that represent indoor, pretty efficient or common outdoor use, and then a final tier and a highest rate that's applied for use above that outdoor amount, in this case 25,000 gallons. Everybody else on the system, we'd maintain a uniform volume rate per 1,000 gallons. For commercial or irrigation only, would have a slightly different volume rate, but this is ultimately the structure. And again, Three Creeks rates under this structure would be set to recover overall the cost of providing service to customers in Three Creek. And we'll bring that forward in a future date as we're talking with the HOA and representatives from Three Creek around these alternatives on a parallel fashion. So this matrix gives a comparison between and amongst the alternatives for some parameters, many of which I've talked about here, but one of the recommendations is the irrigation-only customers pay the base charge or the base rate. Today, they do not. We're recommending that for all alternatives. So that's really not different than the alternatives. That's a little different in how things are handled today. In terms of one of the other elements, the minimum use, well, that isn't in the rates today, and it's not in the rates under Alternative 1, but it is under Alternatives 2 and 3. And then another common item is the Three Creek. We did a customer cost of service for Three Creek and identified a little bit of a gap in the revenue recovery. And so all alternatives will seek to recover that full cost from Three Creek as a class of customers. Another element here, conservation pricing signals, we're seeing that much stronger and included in Alternatives 2 and 3, where it's really not in place today, other than as you use more, you pay a higher amount, but it's not setting as strong of a signal or signal really, other than everybody pays what they use, but that end use is all being charged at that same rate. Under Alternatives 2 and 3, we start to differentiate that more, in the case of Alternative 3, for residential customers only. So in terms of the base rate and how it stacks up, under Alternative 1, this would go up for most of our customers, these 3/4 inch customers, by roughly $2.40. Under Alternative 2, it would go up by a larger amount, almost $5, but keep in mind that that includes 2,000 gallons. So when we kind of back out or price out that 2,000 gallons, it's almost a push. There's no bill increase for a 2,000 gallon using customer, and then the increases would go from there as more water is being demanded. We're also resetting under all alternatives the relationship between 1 inch and larger meters to this 3/4 inch based on the cost of service evaluation and implementation of best practices that recognizes some different relationships for some costs and then maintains effectively a flat charge for others. Keep in mind we've got 2,000 gallons, but we're not increasing that amount for meter sizes. It's 2,000 for 2 inch, it's 2,000 for 4 inch included in this base rate for Alternatives 2 and 3. In terms of the volume rate for Alternative one, we're able to maintain the existing volume rates, and really, so the changes for that one are just in terms of who gets assessed the base rate, irrigation only paying or participating in those costs, which they don't today, and then the additional charges as we're increasing that base rate. Under alternative two, we've got this rate for indoor use year-round at $1.29. That's roughly 85 cents lower, 90 cents lower, I'm sorry, 80 cents lower than today. And then we've got a higher rate for incremental usage above that in the wintertime for all customers to be assessed in the summertime. And it's above the 212 we're assessing today. So larger users or people that use more in the summer relative to the winter will start seeing bill increases. But we're dropping the rate we're recovering for that indoor element, and so that will result in lower bills for some customers or for some customers for portions of the year. Under alternative three, we've got this tiered system, and we've got the minimum 2,000 gallons included in the base rate, so there's no volume for that under alternative three, but today that incurs $2.12. And then we get into the second tier where it's up to 6,000 gallons, and this is about the average of residential customers and what is expected for residents to use indoor. And we're pricing this under alternative three at $1.24, a reduction from the $2.12 today. Under tier three, this is really this typical or efficient outdoor in the peak period, in the peak season, up to 25,000 gallons, or that amount between 6 and 25 would incur a higher charge than it is today, $2.48 relative to $2.12 today. And then lastly, a user that would use monthly more than 25,000 gallons under alternative three, we're going to start sending a stronger pricing signal and charging $3.72, which is $1.60 above the $2.12 that would be assessed today, or coincidentally under alternative one. When we get into non-residential customers, they get the minimum 2,000 gallons in the base rate, and then any amount, metered amount above that under this alternative would also incur $2.12, what is charged today. We're calling out irrigation only a little bit more directly under this alternative, and so their usage above 2,000 gallons a month would be slightly higher, this $2.48, and this is intentionally pegged to the outdoor, the efficient outdoor amount for residential customers. And this also, the town could have enhancements or adjustments to this for irrigation only customers, identifying kind of a tiered system in future rate adjustments once we get complemented with some of this additional data. We could make some of these changes in the future, but for now we've set it at $2.48 or equal to efficient outdoor usage, or the allotment for residential customers. When it comes to customer bill impacts, we've got the bills, a monthly water bill, or a portion of the bill for water services for a 3/4 inch residential customer, and that type of customer that may use at 2,000 or at 5,000 or 15 or lastly at 30,000 gallons, to illustrate some of the differences amongst these structures. So under alternative one, this is most closely mirrors what we're doing today. $2 to $3 change is what we're seeing. Now when we get into alternatives 2 and 3, we start seeing a little bit more nuances, as we've got some changes to the rate structure. And for lower volume users, the current bill is going to be maintained. And we're going to see even upwards of some indoor usage, really a very similar bill, or even a little bit of a decrease. And how we're doing that is for those users that use more, or for the summer bills, is where we're going to be getting more of an increase. And we really see this play out for 30,000 gallon customers, but it would be up until that level. And these are customers under alternative 3 that are getting that 372. So it'll go up even further for those larger users. And that's some of these nuances. And to send that pricing signal, we send it through the bill. So that's one of the results of that choice to send a stronger signal to our rates. For commercial customers, we're seeing the highest bills under alternative 2, and as a reminder, we've got that peak season rate, and in this profile, we're having that winter usage, it'd be at around that 10,000 gallon level. And so the above 10,000 in the summer period is being incurred larger charge. And we're seeing that play out for the larger users in this case. And under alternative 3, impacts similar to those of alternative 1, but it's really coming through the base rate because, as you may recall, for non-residential customers under alternative 3, they're going to pay the same volume rate as they do today, $2.12. So it kind of flattens out the impact a bit, is a outcome of that or those rates and pricing decisions. Irrigation only is impacted 2 ways. First, they don't pay the base rate today, so we have them paying that amount, and in this profile, it's that of an H customer, and so that's going to drive increases just initially. And then the other differences play out through the volume rates, and we're seeing under alternative 2 a slightly higher tiered rate than under alternative 1, and so we've got slightly higher bills there. I'm sorry, alternative 3 and alternative 1, and we've got slightly higher bills, and that's sort of what we're seeing here. Now I'm going to turn my attention to wastewater and talk a bit about wastewater. Both the capital and rate revenue adjustments, the cost of service results, and then the resulting rates through, in this case, 2 alternatives. So wastewater capital, we're projecting that we can fund that all with cash. Over the 10-year period, it's roughly $12 million, and that averages a little more than $1 million a year. The variance isn't quite as large, but there is some, but not quite as large as we're seeing on the water system. And so that's one of the reasons why we're able to cash fund it while maintaining a multi-year levelized rate plan. In this case, we're proposing to generate additional rate revenues through overall 9% adjustments. And we've got a couple alternatives that recover that from different users differently. But overall, that's what we're identifying as being needed, going through a similar process as described for water. And we're anticipating that that could decrease to 8% a year starting in fiscal year 24. And certainly the town will periodically want to update and review this as part of the budget or periodic evaluations of revenue sufficiencies and as actual costs materialize and capital projects get constructed, to keep an eye on this over time. We also looked at the cost of providing service for different users, and this summarizes the results of this. Similar to water, we've got overall, in this case, 9% that we need to generate from additional rate revenues throughout the system. Residential customers are in line with that. And the subsidy we're seeing with wastewater kind of goes the other way, where commercial is being subsidized by multifamily, schools, customers outside of town to some extent, and Three Creek to some small extent as well. And so anybody that is at or below 9 is online if they're equal, or they may be receiving, the case of multifamily, a little bit of, they're providing a little bit of a subsidy. If they're above 9%, they're receiving subsidies from other customers. In this case, it's really commercial where we're seeing this receiving some subsidy, or almost kind of the opposite of what we're seeing on the water side. So in the case of wastewater, we've it's just 2 alternatives, and alternative 1 most closely mirrors the current rate structure, where we've got a base rate that increases by meter size, and there's no minimum volume amount included in that base rate. And then we've got system volume rates for domestic or normal strength that's applied equally to all customers. There's, in case of Three Creek, some differences with Three Creek, but everybody else inside and outside of town pays the same volume rate. There's surcharges assessed for higher strength customers that are, primarily non-residential, and we've updated those, and we're updating those to recover the cost of service. We've also proposing a 9% increase to septic hauler rates, and all of these last 2 items are the same under alternative 2. The big difference is that we're modifying and including this minimum use of 2,000 gallons regardless of meter size, and we're updating the base rates that increase by meter size. And then the resulting system-wide volume rate is different under alternative 2 than it is under alternative 1. So this, like water, we've got a matrix that compares and contrasts the different components of the rate structure and what we're doing and some differences amongst them or in place today in case of some of these parameters. So this is a nice reference for that and comparing the different alternatives. So let's focus in on the base rate. Under alternative 1, we're proposing to increase this for 3/4 inch meters, and we've, like water, updated the relationship of larger meter sizes to that 3/4 inch. We're proposing to increase that to $8 for the most of customers on the system. Under alternative 2, we've got 2,000 gallons. We're including for all users, including the 3/4 inch, and we've got a higher base rate because of that. So in this case, it would be $4.50, but it would also include that 2,000 gallons. So for somebody that has no use, that's going to be a $4.50 increase. But for somebody using 2,000 gallons, it's basically no different than the bill they're paying today. I think it's a slight increase, as we'll see in a minute. On the volume side, again, we've got this minimum allowance. The first 2,000 is included in the base rate. Under alternative 1, we're increasing that to $2.50. And under alternative 2, we're maintaining the $2.27 in place today. So when we look at impacts in a minute, the impacts are going to be solely through the changes in the base rate. And for a residential customer, and we're looking at different amounts of, in this case, winter water, indoor water, what the bills would translate to for those customers. Most of our customers are at around somewhere around this 5,000 gallon amount for residential users. But we see under alternative 1, these increase for all users, and the amount of increase varies with the amount of volume. So the more volume, the higher the bill under alternative 1, and the higher the bill increase relative to the current case where those bills increase as well. But this is where we're seeing the $2.50 play out on top of the base rate. Under alternative 2, the impacts are really more around changes through the base rate, and just because it's pretty flat for these customers, we're not seeing as much of an increase. We're seeing those increases more for different types of users on the system, and some within these data points that these profiles don't play out as well. But it's really just that change in the base rate that generates additional revenue. Same is the case for commercial. And we see this play out in alternative 2 and some different values, but it's pretty close to the current bills. Under alternative 1, this would be where we see larger increases. So you may be asking yourself, well, how are we getting additional revenue? We're getting additional revenue in this case, for those users between that 0 and 2,000 gallons that are just paying lower base rate today. And that married with updating the extra strength surcharges and the 9% increase for septic haulers, that's how we're generating an additional 9% overall. And so with this, and as I mentioned, I'll be presenting some additional survey information for comparisons to resort communities or comparisons to other communities within Wyoming in terms of the rate and the typical residential customer bills today in Jackson, as well as under the proposed alternatives, so we can kind of take that yardstick and see how it compares to other communities. We've also got capacity fee comparisons, primarily for more comparable resort communities, and what we see there, and how the current and the 2 alternatives compare to those other types of resort communities throughout Colorado, California, and Utah. Also be interested in additional input and feedback, and certainly hopefully prepared to answer any question, but we'll be there to answer additional questions you all may have after reviewing the materials that were provided in advance and listening to this pre-recorded presentation. So look forward to seeing you all virtually on the 19th, and hope you have a safe and pleasant weekend and good start to the week next week. Thank you.